Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American Northwest. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1883, 27 men ventured into the dense forests of northern Montana's Bitterroot Range. The logging and fur trade were booming businesses, drawing ambitious men to the untamed wilderness with promises of fortune. Their encampment, established near what is now known as Blackwater Creek, was meant to serve as a base for a season of trapping and hunting. Records show they were well-equipped, well-supplied, and experienced in frontier survival. The leader of the expedition, Jeremiah Holcomb, had organized similar ventures for over 15 years without incident. Yet despite these favorable circumstances, only 9 men would ever emerge from those woods. The disappearance of 18 men represents one of the most perplexing mass vanishings in American frontier history. No bodies were ever recovered. No conclusive explanation was ever provided. The 9 survivors refused to speak of what occurred during those 3 months isolated in the wilderness. What follows is a reconstruction of events based on fragments of journals, local newspaper accounts, territorial records, and the few testimonies that emerged years later when survivors believed no one was listening. The official explanation, as recorded in the Montana Territorial Register, dated April 17, 1883, attributed the losses to harsh winter conditions and possible hostilities with native tribes. Yet weather records from that winter show unusually mild conditions, and the local Salish people had maintained peaceful relations with trappers for decades. Something else happened in those woods, something the survivors worked deliberately to conceal. Mill Creek, Montana Territory, was a modest settlement in 1882, consisting of little more than a general store, a sawmill that gave the town its name, 2 saloons, and a scattering of wooden structures that served as homes and businesses. Situated in a valley with mountains rising in every direction, it was a place where men came to seek their fortunes in lumber, furs, and occasionally gold. The settlement's population fluctuated with the seasons, swelling in spring and summer when the passes were clear, thinning as winter approached. But there were those who saw opportunity in the harsh Montana winters when fur-bearing animals grew their thickest coats and commanded the highest prices. Jeremiah Holcomb was one such opportunist. At 53 years of age, he had spent the better part of his life in the territories. Originally from Pennsylvania, he had moved westward as a young man, working as a surveyor before establishing himself as an organizer of hunting and trapping expeditions. By 1882, his reputation in Mill Creek and surrounding settlements was well established. He was known as a meticulous planner, a strict disciplinarian, and a man who brought his teams back alive. The Mill Creek Gazette from November 1882 contains an advertisement placed by Holcomb, seeking experienced men for winter expedition, 3 months' work, equal shares of profits, previous wilderness experience required. Inquire at Wilson's General Store. According to store ledgers preserved in the territorial archives, 26 men were eventually selected from among the applicants. They ranged in age from 22 to 48. Most had previous experience with Holcomb or came recommended by his associates. A few were newcomers to the territory but brought valuable skills or resources to the venture. The expedition was to be a commercial enterprise, primarily focused on trapping fur-bearing animals and scouting potential logging sites for spring cutting operations. December 3, 1882, BS. The expedition departed from Mill Creek, 27 men in total, riding in 8 wagons loaded with supplies to last through winter and into spring. Territorial records list their names: Jeremiah Holcomb, Augustus Reed, Samuel Perkins, Thomas Fletcher, William Norton, Benjamin Lewis, Charles Winston, Jacob Miller, Isaac Thompson, Frank Wilson, Daniel Roberts, Joseph Davis, Henry Adams, George Stewart, Edward Collins, Michael Williams, Robert Taylor, John Anderson, James Martin, David Brown, Richard Evans, Christopher Hughes, Paul Mitchell, Peter Schmidt, Frederick Cooper, Howard Griffin, and Eli Watson. 9 would return: Holcomb, Reed, Perkins, Fletcher, Norton, Lewis, Winston, Miller, and Thompson. The rest vanished without a trace. This is the story of the Blackwater Creek hunting camp and the terrible secret that has remained buried for over a century and a half. The 27 men who assembled at Wilson's General Store on the morning of December 3, 1882, represented a cross-section of frontier society. Each had answered Holcomb's advertisement for their own reasons, though all shared the common goal of profiting from Montana's abundant natural resources. The fur trade had entered a new boom period, with eastern markets paying premium prices for quality pelts. A successful winter expedition could earn a man more than 2 years' wages in other occupations. Jeremiah Holcomb stood at the center of the group, checking supplies against his detailed inventory lists. His weathered face bore the lines of countless seasons in the wilderness, and his gray-streaked beard was trimmed with the same precision he brought to all his endeavors. Those who had worked with him before knew him as a man who left nothing to chance. His previous expeditions had returned with impressive hauls of beaver, marten, and river otter pelts, making modest fortunes for all involved. Augustus Reed, at 42, served as Holcomb's second-in-command. A former military man who had served with distinction during the war, Reed brought discipline and organizational skills that complemented Holcomb's wilderness expertise. He was known for his ability to read terrain and weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Reed had participated in 3 previous expeditions with Holcomb, each more successful than the last. His inclusion in the party was seen as a guarantee of competent leadership should anything happen to Holcomb. Samuel Perkins, 38, rounded out the expedition's leadership trio. Where Holcomb provided experience and Reed offered military precision, Perkins brought diplomatic skills honed through years of trading with both native peoples and frontier settlements. He spoke passable Salish and had established relationships throughout the region that could prove valuable if the expedition encountered any difficulties. Perkins had made his initial fortune in the California goldfields before turning to the fur trade, finding it more reliable than chasing mineral wealth. Among the younger members of the expedition was Peter Schmidt, just 22 years old, but already showing promise as a tracker. He had grown up in the territories, the son of German immigrants who had established a small ranch near Mill Creek. Schmidt's knowledge of local wildlife patterns and his keen eyesight made him valuable despite his youth. Thomas Fletcher, 45, brought different skills. He was known as the best camp cook in 3 counties and had medical training from his time as an orderly during the war. His presence assured the men of decent meals and basic medical care throughout their isolation. The expedition included several sets of brothers and cousins, common in an era when family connections provided the trust necessary for dangerous ventures. Charles Winston and his younger brother Edward had trapped together for 5 years. The Martin cousins, James and Paul, had recently arrived from Ohio, seeking their fortunes. These family bonds were thought to strengthen group cohesion during the long months of isolation that lay ahead. Financial motivations varied among the men. Some, like merchant Joseph Davis, saw the expedition as an investment opportunity, putting up capital for supplies in exchange for a larger share of profits. Others, like former cavalry scout Isaac Thompson, simply needed work after the Army's reduction following the war's end. The youngest member, Eli Watson, at 19, hoped to earn enough to purchase land and start a farm. The oldest, Howard Griffin, at 48, sought one last profitable season before retiring to San Francisco, where his daughter lived. The morning of departure saw Mill Creek's entire population turn out to see them off. Wives, sweethearts, and children gathered despite the cold, knowing they wouldn't see their men until spring. The 8 wagons were loaded with everything needed for 3 months in the wilderness: flour, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, ammunition, trapping supplies, tools, medical supplies, and even a small library of books for the long winter evenings. Holcomb had learned from experience that mental stimulation was as important as physical supplies for maintaining morale during isolation. As the wagon train pulled out of Mill Creek, several observers noted the optimistic mood of the party. The men sang songs and called out jokes to each other, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. None could have imagined that for 18 of them, this would be their last journey. The local newspaper would later note the cruel irony that such a well-prepared and experienced group would meet with disaster, while countless less organized expeditions returned safely year after year. The economic promise of the fur trade in 1882 was considerable. Beaver pelts brought 8 each at market, marten could fetch 12, and prime river otter commanded prices up to 20. A skilled trapper could reasonably expect to take 100 or more pelts during a winter season. Split among 27 men after expenses, even a moderately successful expedition would provide each man with several $100s. A fortune for laborers accustomed to earning $1 a day. The journey from Mill Creek to what would become known as Blackwater Creek tested even these experienced frontiersmen. The first 3 days followed established trails, the wagons rolling steadily through valleys already familiar to many of the men. They crossed the Clark Fork River at a shallow ford on December 6th, the wheels breaking through thin ice as horses strained against the current. From there, the route turned northwest into increasingly wild territory where few white men had ventured. Holcomb's journal, recovered after the expedition's tragic end, provides detailed accounts of their progress. On December 7th, he wrote, "Made good time today despite rougher terrain. Men in high spirits. Reed scouts ahead and reports favorable passage through next ridge. Snowlight on ground should not impede progress if weather holds." The expedition had been blessed with unusually mild weather for December, with temperatures hovering just below freezing during the day and dropping only moderately at night. By the 5th day, they had left all signs of civilization behind. The forest closed around them, dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. The wagon trail, such as it was, consisted of game paths widened by the occasional trapper or prospector. Progress slowed to mere miles per day as men had to clear fallen timber and navigate around massive boulders deposited by ancient glaciers. On December 9th, they encountered their first significant obstacle. A recent avalanche had blocked the intended pass, forcing them to backtrack and find an alternative route. Samuel Perkins proved his worth here, recalling a native trail he had learned of years earlier. The detour added 2 days to their journey, but brought them through a valley rich with sign of beaver and otter. Several men commented that this alone made the extra travel worthwhile. The landscape grew increasingly dramatic as they penetrated deeper into the Bitterroot Range. Sheer granite faces rose thousands of feet on either side of narrow valleys. Streams cascaded down from hidden springs, their waters running black with tannins from decaying vegetation, a characteristic that would later give Blackwater Creek its name. At night, the men huddled around campfires, the vast darkness of the primeval forest pressing in from all sides. On December 14th, after 11 days of arduous travel, Augustus Reed returned from a scouting expedition with promising news. He had located an ideal site for their winter camp, a relatively flat area where 3 streams converged, providing ample fresh water and natural protection from prevailing winds. The site sat in a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by ridges that would shelter them from the worst winter storms while providing easy access to multiple drainage systems where fur-bearing animals thrived. The men's first view of their new home came as the sun broke through afternoon clouds, illuminating the convergence of waters that would become Blackwater Creek. The largest stream flowed from the north, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. 2 smaller tributaries joined it from the east and southwest, creating a natural hub of animal activity. Beaver dams were visible upstream, and tracks of deer, elk, and smaller game marked the muddy banks. Holcomb wasted no time in organizing construction. The men were divided into work crews with specific tasks. Some began felling trees for cabin construction, selecting straight pines of uniform diameter. Others cleared the building sites, removing undergrowth and leveling ground. A third group started on the foundation stones, gathering flat rocks from the creek bed. The sound of axes rang through the valley from dawn to dusk as the camp took shape. The plan called for 7 smaller cabins, arranged in a rough semicircle, each housing 3 to 4 men, with a larger central structure that would serve as a communal mess hall and meeting place. This arrangement provided both privacy and community. Men could retreat to their own quarters when desired, but gather for meals and evening socializing. The central building would also house the expedition's supplies, keeping them dry and secure from wildlife. Construction proceeded with remarkable efficiency. These men had built such camps before, and each knew his role. The cabin walls rose quickly, using a Swedish cope technique that required no nails or spikes. Logs were carefully notched and fitted, with moss and mud chinking filling the gaps. Roofs were constructed with a steep pitch to shed snow, covered with overlapping bark shingles sealed with pine pitch. By December 21st, exactly 1 week after arrival, the camp was largely complete. The central building stood 20 feet by 30 feet with a massive stone fireplace that could accommodate whole logs. A long table constructed from split logs dominated the center, surrounded by benches where all 27 men could gather for meals. The individual cabins, though smaller, each featured their own fireplace and simple furnishings, bunks, a small table, and storage for personal effects and equipment. Holcomb ordered the construction of a rudimentary stockade around the camp's perimeter. This was not for defense against human enemies, but rather to discourage curious bears and mountain lions from investigating the camp during the night. Sharpened stakes angled outward, creating a barrier that would funnel any approaching wildlife toward 2 gates that could be secured after dark. With shelter established, the men turned to their primary purpose, trapping. Initial surveys of the surrounding area proved extremely promising. Beaver colonies had created a network of ponds throughout the valley. Marten and fisher tracks crisscrossed the hillsides. River otter slides marked the banks of Blackwater Creek itself. The men established trap lines radiating outward from camp like spokes on a wheel, each team responsible for checking and maintaining specific routes. The first pelts began coming in by December 23rd. Frederick Cooper took a prime beaver on his initial set. The Martin brothers brought in 3 fisher pelts of exceptional quality. By Christmas Day, the expedition had accumulated over 40 pelts, carefully cleaned and stretched on willow hoops to dry. At this rate, they would easily surpass Holcomb's projections for the season's take. Life at the Blackwater Creek camp settled into predictable rhythms during those first 5 weeks. The men rose before dawn, kindling fires in the bitter cold and preparing simple breakfasts of coffee, biscuits, and salt pork. By first light, trapping teams headed out to check their lines, a task that could take several hours depending on the route. The afternoon brought different work: processing pelts, maintaining equipment, gathering firewood, hunting for fresh meat to supplement their provisions. Jeremiah Holcomb maintained his expedition journal with the dedication of a ship's captain keeping a log. Each evening, by lamplight, he recorded the day's activities in precise handwriting. Weather conditions, pelts collected, supplies consumed, work completed, and any notable events filled page after page. His entry for December 28, 1882, provides a typical example. Temperature 18 degrees at dawn, clear skies. Norton and Lewis ran eastern line. 2 beaver, 1 marten. Cooper's team brought in 3 beaver from north sector. Total pelts now number 67. Consumed 8 pounds flour, 3 lbs coffee, 5 lbs salt pork. Men's spirits remain high. The meticulous nature of these records would later prove invaluable to investigators trying to piece together what happened at the camp. Holcomb noted not just material matters but also the social dynamics of the group. He recorded disputes and their resolutions, illnesses and recoveries, and the general mood of the expedition. His leadership style emphasized preventing small problems from festering into larger conflicts. Minor disputes were inevitable when 27 men lived in close quarters. On January 20, 1883, Holcomb wrote, "Norton and Schmidt engaged in heated words over card game, separated them before matters escalated, assigned them to different trapping teams for 3 days to allow cooling of tempers." Another entry from January 8 noted, "Williams, accused of taking more than fair share at evening meal, addressed matter publicly, established clear portions for all meals going forward. No further complaints." These small frictions were normal for any expedition. Holcomb had seen worse on previous ventures and knew that quick, fair intervention prevented resentments from building. He rotated team assignments regularly, so men wouldn't grow tired of the same companions. Evening activities were encouraged: card games, storytelling, reading aloud from the small library they'd brought. Eli Watson proved particularly popular for his ability to recite lengthy passages of Shakespeare from memory. The accumulation of pelts exceeded all expectations. By mid-January, they had processed over 200 pelts of various types. The quality was exceptional: thick winter coats with rich coloration that would command top prices at market. Benjamin Lewis, who served as the expedition's clerk, maintained careful records of each man's contributions to ensure fair distribution of eventual profits. The storage cabin began to fill with carefully bundled furs, each marked and cataloged. Fresh meat supplemented their diet regularly. The camp's hunters brought in deer, elk, and the occasional moose. Thomas Fletcher, the camp cook, proved ingenious at creating variety from limited ingredients. His stews, seasoned with wild herbs gathered before the heavy snows, were anticipated eagerly after long days on the trap lines. The men joked that they ate better in the wilderness than many did in town. Evening gatherings in the main cabin became a cherished ritual. After supper, men would linger at the long table, smoking pipes and sharing stories. Veterans of the war recounted battles and narrow escapes. Older trappers told tales of previous expeditions, close encounters with grizzlies, and legendary hauls of furs. The younger men listened with rapt attention, absorbing the lore of their trade. Sundays were observed as a day of rest, following Holcomb's long-established practice. No trapping was done, though essential tasks like feeding horses and gathering firewood continued. Samuel Perkins often read from the Bible, and hymn singing occasionally echoed through the valley. These observances provided structure and a connection to the civilized world they'd left behind. The health of the expedition remained remarkably good. Minor injuries, cuts, bruises, strained muscles were treated competently by Fletcher. One bout of stomach ailment passed through the camp in early January, but resolved quickly. Holcomb credited their good fortune to proper nutrition, adequate rest, and maintaining clean conditions despite the primitive circumstances. By late January, a routine had been so well established that the days blurred together. Holcomb's journal entries grew shorter, often noting simply "all well" or "normal operations." The camp functioned like a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his duties and performing them without need for supervision. Pelts continued to accumulate. The weather remained manageable with no major storms. The success bred confidence, perhaps too much confidence. In his entry for January 20th, 1883, Holcomb wrote, "5 weeks complete. If conditions continue, this will be most profitable expedition yet. Men working well together. No serious disputes or injuries. God willing, we will return to Mill Creek as wealthy men." It was the last truly optimistic entry he would make. Looking back at these records, the normalcy of those first 5 weeks stands in stark contrast to what followed. Nothing in the careful documentation suggests any awareness of approaching danger. The men were experienced, well-supplied, and working in harmony. The wilderness seemed to have accepted their presence, yielding its treasures without resistance. Yet, forces were already in motion that would transform their successful camp into a scene of unexplained horror. The final entry for this period, dated January 20th, concludes, "Noticed unusual tracks near northern trapline. Not quite wolf, not quite bear. Will investigate tomorrow if weather permits." This minor curiosity, noted almost as an afterthought, marked the end of normal operations at Blackwater Creek Camp. Within days, the careful routine that had sustained them would begin to unravel, though Holcomb's meticulous records would continue documenting their descent into nightmare. The morning of January 21st, 1883, dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering near zero. Augustus Reed set out at first light with his partner Daniel Roberts to investigate the unusual tracks Holcomb had noted the previous day. According to the journal entry for that date, they were expected back by midday. When afternoon shadows began to lengthen with no sign of them, concern grew among the men. Reed returned alone just before sunset, and his appearance immediately alarmed those who saw him. Thomas Fletcher later described the scene in a letter to his wife that was never sent. Augustus came stumbling into camp like a man drunk or fevered. His eyes had a wild look, darting about as if seeing things the rest of us could not. When asked about Roberts, he seemed confused, as if he'd forgotten Daniel had accompanied him at all. Holcomb's journal entry for that evening reflects his attempt to maintain order while addressing Reed's disturbing report. Reed returned in agitated state, claims to have discovered an abandoned camp approximately 3 miles north along the ridge, says the site appears old, possibly decades, with unusual markings carved into surrounding trees. When pressed for details about Roberts, became confused and could not account for his whereabouts, have sent Winston and Cooper to search. Reed confined to quarters with hot meal and whiskey for nerves. The search party found Roberts 2 hours later, sitting motionless in the snow less than a mile from camp. He appeared unharmed but disoriented, claiming he had become separated from Reed and lost his way despite his familiarity with the area. When questioned about the abandoned camp Reed described, Roberts insisted they had found nothing unusual, directly contradicting Reed's account. Reed's condition worsened over the following days. Jacob Miller, who shared a cabin with him, later testified that Reed would wake multiple times each night, sitting bolt upright and listening intently to something only he could hear. He'd whisper, "They're calling again," or "Do you hear them?" But there was nothing but the usual night sounds, wind, trees creaking, maybe a distant owl. On January 23rd, Holcomb himself visited the area where Reed claimed to have found the abandoned camp. His journal entry is uncharacteristically vague. Located site, Reed described, evidence of old habitation present. Markings on trees as reported, though their meaning unclear. Geometric patterns that seem to shift perspective when viewed from different angles. Have instructed men to avoid this area until weather improves for proper investigation. That same evening, the first corroborating report came from an unexpected source. Peter Schmidt, the young tracker, approached Holcomb privately after supper. According to Holcomb's notes, Schmidt claims to have heard voices while checking Southern Trapline today, says they sounded like men calling but could not make out words. When he moved toward the sound, it seemed to retreat, always maintaining same distance. Boy is not given to fancy. His report troubles me. The phenomenon spread like a contagion through the camp. Within 3 days, 5 more men reported hearing unexplained voices during their trapline rounds. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Human-sounding calls that seemed to come from multiple directions, words just beyond the edge of understanding, and the unsettling characteristic of maintaining a constant distance no matter how the listener moved. Samuel Perkins attempted to bring rational analysis to the situation. On January 25th, he organized an experiment, positioning men at known distances and having them call to each other to compare with the mysterious voices. His conclusion, recorded in Holcomb's journal, was disturbing. Perkins determines the voices do not behave as natural sound should. They do not echo properly off ridges, do not diminish with distance as expected. He theorizes unusual atmospheric conditions, but seems unconvinced by his own explanation. Reed's mental state continued to deteriorate. He began claiming that the voices were calling specific names, that he could almost understand what they wanted. Fletcher noted that Reed would stand at the edge of camp for hours, staring into the forest, lips moving as if in conversation with unseen companions. When confronted, Reed would shake his head and return to his cabin, but within hours would be back at his vigil. The impact on camp morale was significant. Evening gatherings became subdued affairs with men speaking in hushed tones. The previously cheerful storytelling gave way to nervous silence, broken only by the crack of burning logs. Several men requested reassignment to trap lines away from the northern sector where the phenomena seemed concentrated, but similar reports soon came from all directions. Holcomb attempted to maintain discipline and routine. His journal from January 26th reads, "Have forbidden discussion of voices during working hours. Men must focus on tasks at hand. Whatever the cause, wind through rock formations, natives attempting to frighten us away, or overwrought imagination, we cannot allow it to disrupt operations." Yet his own entries betray growing unease. With multiple references to checking and rechecking the camp's perimeter defenses, On January 27th, an incident occurred that shattered any pretense that the experiences could be dismissed as imagination. The entire camp was awakened near midnight by Reed screaming. Men rushed from their cabins to find him outside in his underclothes, pointing at the forest edge and shouting, "Can't you see them? They're right there. Schmidt is with them. Schmidt is calling me." The disturbing detail was that Peter Schmidt had been missing for 6 hours, having failed to return from his trapline that afternoon. A search was planned for first light, but Reed's claim that he could see Schmidt among whatever watchers he perceived at the forest edge sent a chill through every man present. Holcomb ordered Reed sedated with laudanum and placed under constant watch. As January drew to a close, the camp that had functioned so smoothly for 5 weeks was transformed. Men moved in groups even for the simplest tasks. Conversations died when footsteps approached. Everyone listened, always listened, for sounds that shouldn't be there, and increasingly they heard them. Voices without source, calls without callers, their names spoken by tongues that should not know them. The last entry for January 27th, written in Holcomb's increasingly unsteady hand, reads simply, "Something is terribly wrong here. May God preserve us from whatever walks these woods." Peter Schmidt had always been punctual. In 5 weeks of operations, the young tracker had never returned late from his trapline, which made his absence on the afternoon of January 27th immediately notable. According to Holcomb's journal, Schmidt had departed at dawn to check the northeastern line, a route that typically required no more than 6 hours to complete. When shadows began stretching across the snow and Schmidt hadn't returned, unease rippled through the camp. The search began at first light on January 28th. Frederick Cooper and Paul Mitchell volunteered to trace Schmidt's route, departing with provisions for 2 days, though the trek should have taken only hours. Holcomb's entry notes, Cooper and Mitchell departed 7:15 a.m., clear weather, good visibility. Instructed to fire 3 shots if Schmidt located, return immediately regardless of findings. The northeastern trapline followed a well-established path along a creek drainage, marked at intervals with blazes cut into tree bark. Cooper and Mitchell were experienced woodsmen who had run this very route multiple times. They knew every trap location, every stream crossing, every landmark along the way. Their competence made subsequent events all the more inexplicable. By midday, with no signal shots heard, Holcomb dispatched a second team, Charles Winston and George Stewart, to follow the searchers' tracks. What they found defied explanation. Winston later provided testimony that haunted investigators. "We followed their trail easy enough for maybe 2 miles, clear as day in the snow. Then it just stopped. Middle of a clearing, no trees nearby, no cliffs, no water. Their tracks went in but didn't come out, like they'd been plucked straight up into the sky." The clearing Winston described became a focus of intense scrutiny. Multiple teams visited the site, all confirming the same impossible detail: 2 sets of boot prints entering the clearing, approaching the center, then simply ceasing to exist. No signs of struggle, no blood, no disturbed snow beyond their own tracks. The surrounding trees showed no marks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest the men had climbed or been lifted. They had simply ceased to be present in that space. Holcomb ordered the clearing searched in an expanding spiral pattern. Men spread out, maintaining visual contact, examining every drift and depression. Isaac Thompson discovered Schmidt's possible trail a quarter-mile to the north, or rather, what might have been his trail. The tracks seemed wrong somehow, the gait too long, the impressions too shallow for a man of Schmidt's build. They led further into the forest before disappearing at a stream crossing. 3 men had now vanished without explanation. The pattern that would terrorize the camp was becoming clear. Isolation, even momentary, invited disappearance. Schmidt had been alone on his trapline. Cooper and Mitchell, though paired, had somehow become separated in that clearing. Close examination showed their tracks diverging slightly before both ended. The mathematics of terror were simple. Be alone, and you might vanish. This realization transformed camp dynamics overnight. Men who had previously enjoyed solitary moments now clung to companions with desperate intensity. Private necessities became group affairs. Dignity sacrificed to survival, Holcomb instituted new protocols. Minimum groups of 3 for any activity outside camp, constant visual contact maintained, regular call-outs to confirm presence, yet even these measures would prove insufficient. On January 30th, despite all precautions, Howard Griffin disappeared. He had been part of a wood-gathering detail with 4 other men. According to their testimony, Griffin had been splitting logs while they loaded the sledge. They heard his axe fall silent, but thought nothing of it. Men often paused to catch their breath. Only when they called for him to help with a particularly heavy log did they realize he was gone. His axe lay embedded in a half-split log, his coat draped over a nearby stump, but Griffin himself had vanished as completely as the others. The speed of the disappearance defied comprehension. The other men swore that no more than 30 seconds had passed between the last axe strike and their discovery of Griffin's absence. They had been working in a small clearing, no more than 20 yards across, with clear sight lines. Yet somehow, in broad daylight, within speaking distance of 4 companions, a man had been taken without sound or sign. Eli Watson's account of that day, recorded years later, captures the mounting hysteria. "We ran back to camp like our hair was on fire, yelling the whole way. Didn't care if we looked like cowards. Griffin was just gone, you understand? Gone like he never existed. And we all knew then, knew in our bones, that we weren't dealing with Indians or animals or anything that belonged to God's natural world." The disappearances accelerated. On February 20th, 3 men vanished from different locations around the camp despite traveling in groups. Witnesses reported the same pattern: a moment's inattention, a brief loss of visual contact, and another man gone. Robert Taylor disappeared while his 2 companions investigated a sprung trap merely 10 feet away. Michael Williams vanished when his group briefly separated to navigate around a fallen tree. John Anderson was taken while relieving himself behind a boulder, his companions maintaining verbal contact until his responses suddenly ceased. Holcomb's journal entries from this period reflect a commander watching his expedition disintegrate. Cannot maintain discipline when men disappear before their companions' eyes. 7 gone now. No bodies, no blood, no explanation. Have consolidated remaining men into fewer groups, but this only delays the inevitable. Whatever hunts us grows bolder. The term "hunts us" marked a crucial shift in perception. These were no longer disappearances, but predations. Something was taking the men with deliberate intent and supernatural efficiency. The forest itself seemed complicit, swallowing victims without trace or cry. And as February progressed, the survivors would learn that disappearing was perhaps preferable to what happened to those who were found. The voices began as whispers on the wind. On February 3rd, James Martin reported hearing his brother Paul calling his name during the pre-dawn darkness. Paul had vanished 3 days earlier with Cooper and Mitchell, yet his voice seemed to drift through the trees, pleading for help. It sounded exactly like him, Martin told Holcomb. The way he'd say my name when we were boys and he was in trouble. But when I called back, asking where he was, the voice just repeated my name over and over. Within days, the phenomenon became widespread. Men on watch reported hearing missing companions calling from beyond the firelight. The voices were perfect mimicries. Every inflection, every familiar pattern of speech reproduced with uncanny accuracy. They called out jokes only their friends would understand, mentioned shared memories, pleaded for rescue using intimate nicknames. Yet something was always slightly wrong, a quality the listeners struggled to define. Benjamin Lewis described it best in testimony given months later. The words were right, the voice was right, but the feeling was wrong, like hearing a favorite song played on an out-of-tune piano. Your mind knows what it should sound like, but something fundamental is off. The voices never responded to questions properly, never engaged in actual conversation. They simply called, beckoned, pleaded, always trying to draw listeners away from the safety of numbers. On February 5th, the visual sightings began. Thomas Fletcher was tending the evening stew when he glanced up to see Peter Schmidt standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of firelight. Fletcher dropped his ladle and shouted for others. By the time men grabbed lanterns and approached, the figure had vanished, but Fletcher swore on his mother's grave that it had been Schmidt, the same slight build, the same nervous way of shifting weight from foot to foot. The sightings multiplied rapidly. Cooper was seen near the northern trap line, standing motionless between two pines. Mitchell appeared at dawn, watching the camp from a ridge. Griffin was spotted by the stream, bent as if drinking but never moving. Always at a distance, always retreating when approached, always wrong in some indefinable way despite their familiar appearance. Holcomb's journal entries from this period reveal a mind under extreme strain. His previously neat handwriting became erratic, sentences trailing off mid-thought. February 6th, they watch us now. Can't see them between the trees. Not hiding anymore, just watching, waiting. Mitchell hasn't blinked in the 10 minutes I've observed him. How can he stand so still in this cold? The next entry, undated. The voices never stop now. A chorus of the taken, calling, calling, calling. Some men stuff moss in their ears, but it doesn't help. The voices aren't coming through our ears. They're already inside. Isaac Thompson later described the horrific night of February 7th. We were all in the main cabin, nobody willing to sleep alone anymore. The calling started at sunset. Every man we'd lost, their voices circling the camp. Then Perkins says, "Look at the windows." And there they were, faces pressed against every pane of glass. Our missing friends, staring in at us with eyes that caught the firelight all wrong. Black where they should be white, white where they should be black. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had faced grizzlies and survived blizzards now cowered like children. Some prayed continuously, others sat in catatonic silence. A few laughed at inappropriate moments, a hysterical edge to their mirth. The careful routines that had structured their days collapsed entirely. No one checked trap lines anymore. The accumulated pelts, once their treasure, lay forgotten. Holcomb tried to maintain some semblance of leadership. He organized the remaining men into a single fortified cabin, barricading windows and maintaining constant fires. But his journal showed increasing desperation. February 8, 17 men remain. No, 16. Wilkins is gone, though he was between Roberts and Davis just moments ago. The taken stand in a ring around camp now, visible day and night. They don't approach, they just watch and call. The most disturbing development came on February 9th. Augustus Reed, who had been confined to quarters since his breakdown, suddenly became lucid. He gathered the men and spoke with his old authority. "I understand now. The cave, the markings, it's a door. They came through, and they can't go back without us. They need our faces, our voices, our memories. That's why they take us. They're not killing, they're replacing." Before anyone could respond, Reed walked calmly to the door. Men tried to restrain him, but he possessed unusual strength. "I can hear them explaining," he said. "It all makes sense now. We opened something that should have stayed closed." He walked into the night. The watchers at the forest edge turned in unison to follow his progress. Reed walked among them, and they closed ranks around him. When the group turned back to face the camp, Reed stood among them, his face now bearing the same empty wrongness as the others. Holcomb's final coherent entry, dated February 11th. 9 of us remain. We leave at dawn if any of us survive the night. We'll burn everything. The voices promise such beautiful things if we just step outside. They know our deepest desires, our secret shames. They promise reunion with the taken, promise an end to fear, promise understanding. Lies, all lies, or perhaps not. Perhaps that's worse. God help us. God help those who come after. The pages that follow are filled with fragmentary phrases, sketched symbols resembling those Reed had described from the cave, and repetitive scrawlings. They wear our faces, they wear our faces, they wear our faces. The careful commander who had maintained meticulous records for weeks had been reduced to near incoherence by the horror surrounding his camp. What remained of the expedition prepared for a final escape attempt, knowing that the forest itself had become their enemy. The voices of their lost companions called through the night, growing more insistent, more wrong, more impossible to resist. And at the tree line, patient as winter itself, the taken waited with their borrowed faces and hollow eyes. Isaac Thompson's account, written in 1930 as the last surviving member of the expedition, cast the events at Blackwater Creek in an entirely different light. Holcomb lied in his journal. Thompson wrote with a trembling hand. Whether to protect us from the truth or because he couldn't accept what Reed had found, I cannot say. But there was no abandoned camp. What Reed discovered on January 21st was far worse. According to Thompson, he had been part of the group that accompanied Reed to investigate the unusual tracks. Besides Reed and Roberts, the party included Thompson himself and Peter Schmidt. They followed the strange prints, not quite wolf, not quite bear, for nearly 3 miles along a ascending ridge. The tracks led to a formation of weathered granite that rose like a broken tooth from the forest floor. Reed saw it first, Thompson recalled, a darkness in the rock face that shouldn't have been there. As we approached, it revealed itself as a cave entrance, partially concealed by fallen timber and centuries of moss. But it wasn't the cave itself that made us stop and stare. It was the carvings around the entrance. The markings defied easy description. Cut deep into the granite, they consisted of interlocking geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Thompson wrote, "Looking at them was like trying to focus on something in a dream. The moment you attempted to trace a pattern, it would slip away and reform into something else." Schmidt said they made his eyes water. Roberts complained of dizziness. Despite their unease, the 4 men entered the cave. Reed led with a pine torch, its flickering light revealing that the markings continued along the interior walls, growing more complex and disturbing the deeper they progressed. The cave angled downward, the natural passage widening into chambers that showed signs of ancient working tool marks in the stone, sections of floor worn smooth by countless feet. After perhaps 200 yards, we emerged into a larger chamber, Thompson continued. Our torches couldn't illuminate the far walls, but what we could see defied explanation. The markings here weren't just carved, but inlaid with some material that caught the light strangely, seeming to glow with its own cold phosphorescence. But it was the center of the chamber that drew their attention. Standing freely without any visible support was a rectangular frame of stone, approximately 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The frame was carved from a single piece of rock that appeared different from the surrounding granite, darker, denser, with veins of the same phosphorescent material running through it. It was a doorway, Thompson stated simply. A doorway with no door, standing in the middle of a cave where no doorway should be. Through it, we could see the far wall of the chamber, but the air within the frame shimmered like heat waves rising from summer stone. Roberts wanted to leave immediately, his instincts warning him against whatever unnatural force had created this aberration. Reed, however, was fascinated. He circled the doorframe, noting that it looked identical from both sides, the carvings continuing around its entire perimeter in one unbroken pattern. When he passed his hand near the frame's opening, he jerked it back as if burned, though he claimed it was intense cold, not heat, that he'd felt. Schmidt, with the curiosity of youth overcoming caution, picked up a small stone and tossed it through the frame. Thompson's account becomes particularly detailed here. The stone entered the shimmer and simply ceased. It didn't pass through to strike the far wall. It didn't fall to the ground. It was there one moment, gone the next. We could hear no sound of it landing anywhere. This should have been sufficient warning. But something about the doorframe exerted an almost hypnotic fascination. Schmidt moved closer, peering into the shimmering space. He said he could see something moving in there, Thompson wrote, like shadows without anything to cast them. He leaned closer, reached out his hand. What happened next would haunt Thompson for the rest of his life. Schmidt stepped forward, apparently intending to examine the frame's edge, but he misjudged the distance or was drawn by some force they couldn't perceive. His reaching hand entered the shimmering space, and in that instant, his entire body was pulled through as if grabbed by an invisible hand. There was no struggle, no cry, Thompson recorded. Schmidt was standing before us one moment, gone the next. Not passed through to the other side. The far wall remained visible and unobstructed. He had simply stepped into nowhere and vanished. The 3 remaining men fled the cave in panic. Reed wanted to return immediately with more men and equipment, convinced they could retrieve Schmidt. Roberts refused to speak of what they'd seen. Thompson found himself caught between them, terrified but unable to deny what he'd witnessed. "We agreed to tell Holcomb that we'd found an abandoned camp," Thompson confessed. It seemed more believable than the truth. But Reed couldn't leave it alone. He returned to the cave, alone despite our warnings. When he came back, he was changed. He spoke of voices calling from beyond the doorframe, of shadows that wore familiar shapes, of promises that our minds couldn't quite grasp, but our hearts yearned to believe. The doorframe, Thompson believed, was indeed what Reed would later call it, a door between worlds. Something that should have remained closed had been opened, or perhaps had never been properly sealed. And Schmidt, in stepping through, had allowed something to notice our world, to follow his path back, to begin the systematic harvesting of the expedition. They needed us, Thompson wrote in his final testament. Whatever dwelt beyond that doorframe, they needed our forms, our voices, our memories to exist in our world. Each man taken was replaced by something that looked like him, sounded like him, but was fundamentally other. And once they had enough of us, once they understood how we worked, they no longer needed to hide their true nature. Thompson's account explained the voices, the sightings, the impossible disappearances. The entities were learning, adapting, becoming better at mimicry, with each victim claimed. The cave was their anchor point, the doorframe their passage, and the expedition their raw material for infiltration into our reality. I pray that the cave was sealed as the recovery expedition reported, Thompson concluded. But I fear that once opened, such doors can never truly be closed. They are out there still, wearing the faces of those they took, learning to be human, spreading further with each passing year. And sometimes, in the deep of night, I hear Schmidt calling my name and know that one day I will answer. February brought a darkness deeper than winter night to the Blackwater Creek camp. On February 3rd, as the sun struggled through gray clouds, a wood-gathering party made a discovery that shattered what little stability remained. Paul Mitchell was found sitting against a pine tree approximately 1 mile from camp, eyes open, frost coating his face and hands. He had been missing for 6 days. At first we thought he was dead, Charles Winston later testified. Frozen solid, we figured. But when we got close, his eyes moved, tracked us. Lewis reached out to check for breathing, and Mitchell spoke. One word: cold. Then he toppled forward into the snow. They carried Mitchell back to camp, his body rigid as cordwood. In the warmth of the main cabin, he began to thaw. But something was profoundly wrong. His skin remained pale as parchment, his breathing so shallow as to be nearly imperceptible. When Thomas Fletcher examined him, he found no injuries, no frostbite despite days of exposure, no explanation for Mitchell's condition. Mitchell survived 18 hours. During that time, he spoke only in fragments. The door. They showed me the door. So many waiting to come through, wearing our skins like coats. His eyes, when open, reflected the firelight strangely, showing depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical. Just before dawn on February 4th, he began convulsing. When the fit passed, Paul Mitchell was dead, his features frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Holcomb's journal entry for that morning consists of a single line. Mitchell died. We are 19 now. The dam of restraint that had held the entities back seemed to break with Mitchell's death. February 4th became known among the survivors as the Day of Taking. It began with the morning watch, Joseph Davis and Henry Adams failing to sound the dawn bell. When men emerged from their cabins, they found the watch post abandoned, rifles leaning against the wall, coffee still warm in tin cups. Before search parties could be organized, Richard Evans vanished from inside the main cabin. According to multiple witnesses, Evans had been seated at the table, head in his hands, when the man beside him turned to speak to another. That moment's inattention was enough. Evans's seat was empty, his boots still positioned beneath the table as if he'd simply ceased to exist. From the knees up, panic set in. Men huddled in the center of the cabin, backs together, eyes scanning constantly. It didn't matter. Christopher Hughes was taken while standing in a circle of 6 men, each swearing they never looked away. He was there, then he wasn't, like a candle flame extinguished by an unfelt wind. The impossible nature of the disappearances shattered rational thought. By nightfall on February 4th, 7 more men had vanished. Davis, Adams, Evans, Hughes, William Norton, David Brown, and Edward Collins. The mathematics of terror was simple and horrifying. From 19 survivors at dawn to 12 by dusk, Holcomb's journal reflected his disintegrating command: cannot maintain watch, cannot maintain sanity. They take men from our midst like hawks taking mice. No defense possible against an enemy that exists outside natural law. The remaining men made a desperate decision. They would crowd into a single cabin, maintain physical contact at all times, create a human chain that couldn't be broken. Benjamin Lewis suggested tying themselves together with rope. The plan seemed sound until they realized they would need to retrieve rope from the supply cabin 30 yards away. 4 men ventured out, moving as a unit: George Stewart, Frank Wilson, Robert Taylor, and James Martin. Witnesses watched from the windows as they crossed the snow-covered ground. 20 yards from the main cabin, all 4 men stopped simultaneously, as if hearing something. They turned their heads in unison toward the forest. Then, moving with mechanical precision, they began walking toward the trees. "We screamed at them," Jacob Miller later recounted, "hollered till our throats were raw. They didn't respond, didn't look back, just walked steady as you please into the forest. We could see them for maybe 50 yards before the trees swallowed them. Never saw them again." The horror deepened that night. The taken began to return not as rescuers, but as sentinels. Mitchell stood among them now, his dead face animated by something else's will. The disappeared men formed a ring around the camp, standing motionless in the snow, their borrowed faces slack with inhuman patience. They didn't call anymore. They simply watched. Holcomb's journal becomes increasingly fragmented. February 5th, Stewart found dead this morning. No wound, no mark, face twisted. Others say he screamed in his sleep, then silence. "We are 11. No, 10. Perkins is gone," was holding his hand when it happened. "Hand still there, rest of him gone. God has abandoned this place." The entries continue with decreasing coherence. February 6, they promise it doesn't hurt. February 7, can see through their eyes sometimes, so many waiting beyond the door. February 8, why do we resist? They offer unity, purpose, freedom from fear. February 9, 5 remain. Or is it 6? Hard to remember their faces anymore. Our faces. Which are ours? The systematic destruction of the expedition had taken less than 2 weeks. From a thriving camp of 27 experienced frontiersmen to a handful of terrorized survivors huddled in a single cabin, while things that wore their friends' faces waited in patient rings outside. The pelts that had promised wealth lay forgotten. The careful plans and routines that had structured their lives were meaningless. In later testimony, Isaac Thompson would describe those final days in the camp. "We stopped being men, became animals, worse than animals. Animals run from danger. We could only wait for our turn to be taken." And always, always, the ones who'd been taken stood watching, promising in voices we knew that joining them would end the fear. Some nights, that seemed like mercy. The February horror had transformed Blackwater Creek from a place of enterprise to a site of supernatural predation. What had begun with mysterious voices had become an extinction event, leaving only 9 souls to attempt what seemed an impossible escape from forces that defied every natural law they understood. The first detailed description of the transformed came from Benjamin Lewis, whose meticulous nature as expedition clerk extended to his observations of horror. In testimony given months later, he struggled to articulate what made the figures at the forest edge so fundamentally wrong. You'd see Mitchell or Cooper standing there, and every detail was correct: the color of their coat, the way Cooper favored his left leg from an old injury. But looking at them was like looking at a perfect painting of a man rather than the man himself. Too still, too precise, too empty. The stillness was what most witnesses remembered first. Human beings, even when trying to remain motionless, exhibit countless tiny movements, breathing, blinking, subtle shifts of weight. The taken displayed none of these. They stood like statues carved from flesh, unaffected by wind or cold, maintaining positions that would have exhausted living muscles within minutes. "I watched Schmidt for 2 hours," Thomas Fletcher would later recount. "Never once did he blink. Snow built up on his shoulders, his hat, even his eyelashes. When a branch cracked nearby, every living man startled and looked. Schmidt never twitched, just kept staring at our cabin with those horrible eyes. The eyes haunted every survivor's testimony. Where human eyes showed white sclera surrounding colored irises, the Taken displayed the inverse black where white should be, with pale irises that caught light like an animal's. But unlike animal eye shine, which reflects at certain angles, these eyes seemed to generate their own cold luminescence, visible even in full daylight. Movement, when it came, was worse than stillness. Jacob Miller described watching Howard Griffin approach the camp perimeter. He didn't walk like a man who'd spent 40 years on his feet. Each step was deliberate, mechanical, like someone learning to work marionette strings. His knees bent too far, his arms swung wrong. And when he turned his head to track our movement through the windows, it rotated too smoothly, too far, like an owl's. The Taken appeared to be learning human movement through observation, with varying degrees of success. Newer additions to their ranks moved with jerky, unnatural gaits. Those taken earlier had refined their mimicry but still exhibited tails, walking without the natural sway of balance, turning with their entire body rather than leading with their head, or simply forgetting to breathe for minutes at a time. Samuel Perkins documented the siege mentality that gripped the survivors. "We've become prisoners in our own camp. They don't attack, don't threaten, just stand and watch." Day and night, the ring of familiar faces grows. We've counted 23 now, more than we've lost, which raises questions I dare not contemplate. Some wear faces we know. Others are strangers, perhaps from expeditions that vanished years ago. The psychological warfare was devastating. Men who had maintained composure during the disappearances broke down entirely when confronted by the animated shells of their companions. One survivor, whose name Thompson declined to record, attempted to speak with his brother among the Taken. The entity wearing his brother's face responded with perfect mimicry of his voice, but spoke only in repetitive phrases. "Join us. No more cold, no more fear. Join us." As February progressed, the Taken began displaying new behaviors. They would mirror the movements of those in the cabin. If a man raised his hand, 20 hands would rise in unison outside. If someone spoke, lips would move silently beyond the windows, practicing the shapes of words. Most disturbing were the moments when all the Taken would suddenly turn to stare at a single survivor, as if receiving instructions about their next target. "They're studying us," Augustus Reed said during one of his lucid moments, "learning how we work, what makes us human. They need our patterns, our memories, our essence. The bodies are just costumes. What they're after is what makes us ourselves." The siege took its toll in ways beyond terror. Sleep became nearly impossible with the ring of watchers maintaining their vigil. Men who dozed reported dreams of walking among the Taken, seeing through borrowed eyes, feeling the terrible freedom of existing without human needs or limitations. Some woke claiming they could sense the vast intelligence directing the entities, a presence that viewed human consciousness like a child examining insects. Holcomb attempted to maintain military discipline, organizing watches and rationing supplies, but his journal revealed the futility. Watches are meaningless when the enemy doesn't attack. Food calculations pointless when men are too terrified to eat. We're not under siege in any way I understand from war. We're specimens being observed, catalogued, selected. The breaking point came on February 10th. The Taken had stood motionless for days, but that morning they began to move. Not toward the camp, but in patterns, complex formations that reminded witnesses of the geometric carvings in Reed's cave. They walked in intersecting circles, creating designs in the snow that hurt to perceive, as if the patterns themselves were wrong for human eyes. "It was a ritual," Thompson wrote years later, "or maybe a summoning. The patterns they traced seemed to fold space in ways I can't describe. The air above their formation shimmered like heat waves, but the temperature was below freezing, and through that shimmer we could see shapes, waiting, so many more waiting to cross over." The final entry in Holcomb's journal before the escape attempt captures the hopelessness. They don't need to attack. They've already won. Each night another man speaks of joining them voluntarily. The promise of ending this terror, of understanding what lies beyond, grows harder to resist. I fear we're not fleeing to save our lives, but to prevent ourselves from choosing to surrender them. God forgive us for what we've unleashed. God forgive us for what we're about to do. The 9 who would survive made their desperate plans while surrounded by the patient, watching faces of the taken entities that had learned to wear human form but could never quite disguise the alien intelligence animating them. The siege would end not with violence but with flight, leaving behind questions that would haunt investigators for generations. The decision to flee came in the pre-dawn darkness of February 11th, 1883. The 9 remaining men, Holcomb, Reed, Perkins, Fletcher, Norton, Lewis, Winston, Miller, and Thompson had huddled through another sleepless night while the taken performed their geometric patterns in the snow outside. According to Thompson's later account, it was Lewis who finally spoke what all were thinking. "If we stay, we either die or become like them. I'd rather freeze in the forest and join that mockery of life." The escape plan was born of desperation rather than strategy. They couldn't leave as a single group. The taken would surely follow en masse. Instead, they would scatter, each man or pair taking a different route, hoping to divide their pursuers. They would burn the camp behind them, destroying the supplies and pelts that had once seemed so valuable, leaving nothing for whatever intelligences had claimed this place. Holcomb's final journal entry, scrawled in the margins of an earlier page, read, "We leave at first light. May God guide us through the wilderness and deliver us from whatever hell we've stumbled upon. If any find this record, do not seek us. Do not come to this cursed place. Let the forest reclaim it all." As dawn grayed the eastern sky, the survivors made their move. Thompson described the moment. "We burst from the cabin simultaneously, each running for different points of the compass." The taken didn't react immediately. They stood frozen in their formations, as if processing this unexpected action. That hesitation gave us perhaps 30 seconds before they began to move. Reed and Miller headed northeast, the most direct route to Mill Creek. Winston and Thompson chose southeast, hoping to reach the Clark Fork River. Holcomb led Perkins and Fletcher due south, while Norton and Lewis struck out west, planning to circle back to civilization. Each pair carried minimal supplies, some dried meat, matches, ammunition, and whatever clothing they could layer on their bodies. Before fleeing, Holcomb had spread kerosene throughout the main cabin and set it ablaze. The fire caught quickly in the dry winter air, and soon the entire camp was burning. Thompson, looking back from the ridge, saw the taken still standing in their formations as flames consumed the buildings around them. "They didn't flee the fire," he wrote, "just stood there watching us leave while their stolen faces reflected the orange light." The journey that followed defied conventional description. Each survivor's account differed dramatically, as if they had traveled through different landscapes entirely. Reed and Miller reported covering impossible distances, finding themselves at creek crossings that should have been days away after only hours of travel. Winston and Thompson described forests that rearranged themselves, familiar landmarks appearing in wrong locations, the sun seeming to move backwards across the sky. "The taken followed us," Thompson wrote, "but not as men would follow. We'd glimpse them standing ahead on ridges we hadn't yet reached. They'd appear beside us when we stopped to rest, maintaining that terrible stillness, those inverted eyes watching without blinking. Sometimes they spoke with the voices of our lost companions, offering directions that we knew would lead us back to the camp." Norton and Lewis reported the most disturbing encounters. On their third night, they made camp in a small cave to escape a blizzard. In the morning, they found messages carved into the stone walls, messages in their own handwriting that neither remembered creating. "Come back," the messages read. "The door is open. We are waiting." They fled the cave to find their own footprints, leading both in and out, as if they had already left and returned multiple times. Perkins, Fletcher, and Holcomb experienced temporal distortions. They would make camp at nightfall only to wake and find the sun in the same position as if no time had passed. Their food supplies didn't diminish despite eating. Their beards didn't grow. Fletcher's pocket watch ran backward, then stopped entirely. "We might have been traveling for days or weeks," Fletcher later stated. Time itself seemed negotiable in that cursed forest. The taken didn't pursue in any conventional sense. They simply appeared, always maintaining distance, always watching. But their presence had an effect beyond mere observation. The survivors reported increasing difficulty remembering their lives before the expedition. Names of loved ones escaped them. The reasons for fleeing began to seem unclear. The promises the taken whispered of understanding, of freedom from human limitations, grew more appealing with each passing day. By the 8th day, or what we thought was the 8th day, Miller testified, Reed was talking to them regular-like, having whole conversations with things wearing our friends' faces. He'd tell us what they offered knowledge of what lay beyond the door, existence without pain or fear, unity with something vast and ancient. Took both Thompson and me to keep him from walking off to join them. The forest itself seemed complicit in their torment. Paths that should have led toward civilization curved back toward the camp. Streams flowed uphill. The stars wheeled in unfamiliar patterns. Yet somehow, against all logic, the survivors began to near the edges of the wilderness. Thompson credited their escape not to navigation but to will. We didn't find our way out. We forced our way out, refusing to accept the forest's attempts to keep us. On what they believed was the 10th day, the scattered groups began emerging from the forest. Reed and Miller stumbled into Mill Creek at dawn. Winston and Thompson arrived at midday. The others straggled in throughout the day, with Holcomb arriving last as darkness fell. They had survived, but the men who emerged bore little resemblance to those who had entered the forest months before. Physical examinations would show them malnourished, but not critically so, not what would be expected after 10 days with minimal supplies. Their clothes showed wear consistent with months of use, not days. Most disturbing, several men had objects in their possession they didn't remember acquiring. Stones with the same geometric carvings from the cave, scraps of paper with messages in unknown languages, and in Thompson's case, a small metal object that seemed to bend light around itself. The forest had released them, but whether as escapees or as carriers of something larger remained an open question. The 9 survivors had fled the horror of Blackwater Creek, but as subsequent events would prove, they had not fled far enough to escape its influence. The morning of March 12th, 1883, began like any other in Mill Creek until Martha Simmons, opening her general store, saw Augustus Reed stumbling down the main street. She would later describe the encounter to the territorial authorities. I almost didn't recognize him, gaunt as a scarecrow, clothes hanging in tatters, but it was his eyes that struck me cold, like he was looking through me at something else, something I was grateful I couldn't see. Reed collapsed outside Wilson's general store, mumbling incoherently about doors and voices. Within hours, the other survivors began arriving, each alone despite having supposedly fled in pairs. Jacob Miller appeared at midday, found sitting motionless by the town well, unable or unwilling to explain how he'd gotten there. Winston emerged from the forest at the town's edge, walking with the mechanical gait the taken had displayed, though this observation went unnoted at the time. The physical condition of the survivors presented the first mystery. Dr. Elias Whitman, Mill Creek's physician, examined each man as they arrived. His medical reports, preserved in territorial archives, note expected severe malnutrition, frostbite, and exposure symptoms consistent with 10 days wilderness survival in winter conditions. Instead found moderate weight loss, no frostbite despite inadequate clothing, and physical condition suggesting several weeks rather than months of hardship. More troubling were the psychological evaluations. The men exhibited what Dr. Whitman termed profound dissociative states. They struggled to maintain eye contact, started at commonplace sounds, and displayed gaps in memory that went beyond trauma. Several couldn't immediately recall their own names or recognized family members. Thompson, when asked about his journey back, simply stared at the wall and repeated, "The forest lets go when it chooses. We didn't escape. We were released." Sheriff James Blackwood, grandfather of the Theodore Blackwood who would later investigate the case, took charge of the official inquiry. His first challenge was the wildly conflicting testimonies. Reed claimed the expedition had been attacked by hostile natives, despite no evidence of violence and the peaceful relations with local tribes. Miller insisted they'd encountered a disease that drove men mad, causing them to wander into the forest. Winston refused to speak at all for the first 3 days. "Each man tells a different tale," Sheriff Blackwood wrote in his initial report. More concerning, they seemed genuinely to believe their contradictory accounts. Whatever befell the expedition has fractured their ability to maintain a consistent narrative of events. The arrival of Jeremiah Holcomb at dusk should have provided clarity. As expedition leader and meticulous record keeper, his testimony would carry the most weight. But Holcomb appeared the most changed of all. Witnesses described him moving through town like a sleepwalker, his renowned discipline replaced by vacant distraction. When Sheriff Blackwood questioned him, Holcomb handed over his journal without comment, then remained silent for the duration of the interview. The journal itself raised more questions than it answered. The early entries showed Holcomb's characteristic attention to detail, but as the dates progressed, the writing became increasingly erratic. Pages were missing, torn out rather than cut. Some entries were written in what appeared to be different handwriting, though Holcomb acknowledged all as his own. Most disturbing were the sketches in the margins, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, crude drawings of doorways standing in impossible spaces. Town reactions to the survivors ranged from sympathy to suspicion. The families of the missing men demanded answers that the survivors couldn't or wouldn't provide. Mary Schmidt, Peter's mother, confronted Thompson directly. "Where is my boy? You left with 27 and returned with 9. Where are the others?" Thompson's response, recorded by witnesses, chilled those present. "They're still there. They'll always be there. But they're also here. They're everywhere now." The territorial government, alerted by Sheriff Blackwood's preliminary report, dispatched additional investigators. The survivors were separated to prevent collaboration on their stories, yet their accounts grew more similar rather than less. All began speaking of a cave, of something that had come through, of the forest itself being wrong. Details that hadn't appeared in initial testimonies emerged. The geometric patterns, the voices calling names, the taken standing at the forest's edge. Physical evidence complicated the investigation further. The possessions found on the survivors included items none remembered acquiring. Lewis carried a pocket watch, engraved with symbols matching those in Holcomb's journal. Fletcher had stones in his pockets, covered in carvings that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Miller's pack contained pages written in his hand, describing events he swore never occurred. The men show signs of extreme trauma, Dr. Whitman's final report stated, but also of something else. They speak of experiences that violate natural law. Under normal circumstances, I would diagnose shared delusion brought on by isolation and hardship. Yet the physical evidence and the specific, consistent details that emerge suggest something beyond conventional explanation. As March progressed, the survivors' behavior grew increasingly peculiar. They would gather without planning, standing in geometric patterns that matched the sketches in Holcomb's journal. When questioned, they seemed surprised by their own actions. Reed was found one night attempting to recreate the cave symbols on the side of a building, claiming he needed to keep the door closed. The investigation expanded as Sheriff Blackwood attempted to verify any aspect of the survivors' account. The scheduled supply run that should have occurred in January had found the trail impassable due to snow, or so the traders claimed. Now they admitted the truth. They'd reached the vicinity of the camp but turned back when their horses refused to proceed, when the forest itself seemed to resist their passage. By month's end, Mill Creek had become a town divided. Some citizens demanded the survivors be quarantined or exiled, fearing they'd brought back some contagion. Others insisted on mounting a rescue expedition for the missing men, refusing to accept they were gone. The survivors themselves seemed caught between worlds, physically present but psychologically elsewhere, bearing witness to horrors they could barely articulate. The official investigation would conclude with more questions than answers, setting the stage for decades of speculation and further inquiry. But in those first weeks of March 1883, as 9 broken men struggled to readjust to a reality they no longer fully inhabited, the true horror of Blackwater Creek began its slow spread outward from that remote Montana valley. The first recovery expedition departed Mill Creek on March 20th, 1883, guided by Benjamin Lewis and Thomas Fletcher. The party of 12 armed men expected a straightforward, if difficult, journey to the abandoned camp. What they encountered instead defied explanation. Lewis, despite having traveled the route countless times, became disoriented within 2 days. Landmarks he swore should be present were missing. Streams flowed in directions that contradicted both memory and maps. The forest had changed. Expedition member William Garrett later reported, not just details, but fundamental geography. Lewis would insist a ridge should be to our north, but we'd find it south. Fletcher recognized individual trees, but in locations miles from where they should stand. It was as if the land itself had been rearranged. After 10 days of increasingly frustrated searching, the expedition returned to Mill Creek empty-handed. Lewis was found sitting by the campfire one morning, drawing the geometric patterns from the cave in the dirt, apparently unconscious of his actions. When questioned, he had no memory of creating them. Fletcher complained of dreams where he walked through the forest, seeing it from multiple angles simultaneously, like looking through a broken mirror. Sheriff Blackwood, unsatisfied with these results, organized a second, larger expedition for June when snowmelt would ease travel. This party included surveyors, a photographer, and specific instructions to maintain detailed compass readings and landmark documentation. They also carried dynamite, Blackwood having grown suspicious of references to a cave in the survivors' testimonies. The June expedition succeeded where the first had failed, though their success brought more questions than answers. Led by experienced tracker Donald McKinnon, who had no connection to the original expedition, they located the Blackwater Creek Camp on June 15, 1883. What they found challenged rational explanation. The camp existed exactly where the survivors had indicated, but its condition suggested abandonment for years rather than months. Cabin logs showed advanced weathering. Metal tools had rusted to uselessness. Most disturbing, the fire damage Holcomb claimed to have set showed patterns of age inconsistent with a February burning. The expedition photographer, James Harrison, documented everything, his photographs later becoming crucial evidence. McKinnon's report described the scene. Found 7 cabin foundations arranged in circular pattern as described, evidence of fire damage throughout. No human remains discovered despite thorough search. Personal effects scattered but showing unusual preservation papers unburned next to charred logs, glass bottles melted yet sitting on intact wooden shelves, defies natural fire behavior. The search expanded to the surrounding area. Following directions reluctantly provided by Augustus Reed, they located the cave 1 mile north of the camp. The entrance, partially concealed by brush, bore carved symbols that matched those in Holcomb's journal and the survivors' possessions. Several expedition members reported headaches and disorientation when attempting to study the markings directly. McKinnon ordered the cave explored, but the 3 men who entered emerged within minutes, visibly shaken. They reported that the cave extended much deeper than should be possible given the hillside's geography, and that strange acoustics made whispered conversations audible from impossible distances. Most unsettling, they found recent footprints in the dust footprints that matched boots worn by the missing expedition members. Rather than risk further exploration, McKinnon followed Blackwood's instructions. The cave entrance was packed with dynamite and detonated on June 17th. The explosion succeeded in collapsing the entrance, but witnesses reported that the sound echoed far longer than it should have, and that the smoke from the blast formed patterns reminiscent of the geometric symbols before dispersing. Back in Mill Creek, medical examination of the survivors continued under Dr. Whitman's supervision, now assisted by Dr. Charles Pemberton, a specialist in nervous disorders from St. Louis. Their findings, published in the Missouri Medical Journal, documented symptoms never before recorded in medical literature. The survivors showed what Pemberton termed temporal displacement syndrome. They would react to events seconds before they occurred, flinching before doors slammed, answering questions before they were fully asked. Brain examinations were primitive in 1883, but both doctors noted that the men's pupils reacted to light in unusual patterns, dilating and contracting in rhythms that seemed unconnected to external stimuli. Physical symptoms included unexplained scarring in geometric patterns on several survivors' bodies, scars they swore hadn't existed before the expedition. These marks would reportedly shift position slightly between examinations, though both doctors admitted this could be observational error. More concrete were the men's altered sleep patterns. They slept precisely 4 hours nightly, all entering and leaving sleep at exactly the same times, regardless of location or circumstances. The survivors exhibit a shared physiological connection that defies medical explanation, Pemberton wrote. They function less as individuals than as components of some larger organism. When one experiences pain, others flinch. When one recalls a memory from the expedition, others supply details without prompting. It's as if their experience has fundamentally altered their neurological separation. Sheriff Blackwood's investigation expanded beyond the survivors to historical records. He discovered references to similar disappearances in the region dating back to the earliest French trappers. Native oral tradition spoke of places where the world grew thin and warned against lingering near certain geological formations. A pattern emerged of expeditions that ventured into specific areas and returned with members missing and survivors changed. Most disturbing was a journal located in the Territorial Archives from 1821. A Russian fur trader named Volkov described finding an abandoned native village near what would later become the Blackwater Creek area. The village showed no signs of violence, but geometric symbols were carved into every structure. Volkov's men, who examined the symbols closely, suffered from nightmares and temporal confusion similar to the Stillwell survivors. By late June, Blackwood had compiled hundreds of pages of testimony, evidence, and historical precedent. His conclusion, filed with the territorial government, was carefully worded. While the exact fate of the 18 missing men cannot be determined, evidence suggests they encountered phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. Recommend the area be marked as dangerous and avoided. The 9 survivors should be monitored, but pose no apparent threat to public safety. Privately, Blackwood was less circumspect. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Something has touched these men, changed them in ways we lack words to describe. They've glimpsed something beyond the veil of our reality, and that glimpse has marked them forever. I fear we've sealed the cave, but not the door it represented. God help us if others find similar passages." The aftermath of Blackwater Creek scattered the 9 survivors like seeds blown on an ill wind. Within weeks of their return, each man had departed Mill Creek, unable to bear the stares of townspeople or the questions of the bereaved families. They sought distance from each other and from the memories that haunted them, though, as events would prove, no distance was sufficient to escape what they had experienced. Augustus Reed was the first to die. On October 3, 1884, barely 18 months after the expedition's return, he was found in his Portland boarding house room, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His landlady, Mrs. Catherine Powell, testified that Reed had been a model tenant until the final week, when he began speaking to empty corners of his room and drawing geometric patterns on the walls. His suicide note consisted of a single line: "They never stopped calling. I'm going to answer." The pattern of deaths that followed suggested something beyond simple trauma. Samuel Perkins drowned in California's Sacramento River on January 15, 1885. Witnesses reported he walked into the water fully clothed on a clear day, making no attempt to swim, despite being known as a strong swimmer. His wife later revealed he had been suffering from dreams where he was underwater, but breathing, seeing through eyes that weren't his own. Thomas Fletcher lasted until March 1884. Found hanging in his barn in Missouri, his death might have been dismissed as another frontier suicide, if not for the unusual circumstances. His wife reported that Fletcher had been calm that morning, even cheerful, speaking of finally understanding the pattern. The coroner noted that Fletcher's expression showed not peace, but terror, his eyes wide open and fixed on something beyond the barn rafters. Charles Winston's death in November 1884 was perhaps the most disturbing. Working as a night watchman in Denver, he simply vanished during his shift. His clothes were found neatly folded at his post, his revolver unfired, his logbook open to an entry that read, 3:0 a.m. "They're here. The door is opening again. I can see the other side clearly now." His body was never recovered, leading to speculation that, unlike the others, Winston had found a way back to whatever realm had touched them at Blackwater Creek. Benjamin Lewis survived until February 1885, maintaining the most normal existence of any survivor until the end. He had resumed his work as a clerk in Chicago, married, and rarely spoke of the expedition. His wife discovered him at his desk one morning, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. However, the papers before him told a different story. He had spent his final hours writing the same phrase repeatedly in increasingly erratic handwriting. "We brought them back with us. We brought them back with us. We brought them back with us." Jeremiah Holcomb, the expedition leader, died by his own hand in Seattle on September 14, 1885. His final journal entry revealed a man haunted not just by the loss of his men, but by the growing certainty that their return had been orchestrated. "We thought we escaped. Now I understand we were released for a purpose. We are carriers, seeds of something that needed to spread beyond that valley. Every night I see them, not just our lost companions, but hundreds, thousands, waiting to cross through. The door we found was just one of many. God forgive me for leading them to it." William Norton died in a railway accident in June 1884, though witnesses claimed he stepped deliberately in front of the locomotive. His last words, heard by platform workers, "Finally, a door I can understand." Of the 9 survivors, only Jacob Miller and Isaac Thompson lived to old age, each finding different ways to cope with their experience. Miller became a recluse, settling in a remote cabin in Oregon, where he lived quietly until his death from natural causes in 1927 at age 76. Neighbors reported he never slept in darkness, maintaining oil lamps throughout the night, and would sometimes be heard conducting conversations with invisible companions in languages they didn't recognize. Thompson chose a different path, maintaining as normal a life as possible while privately documenting everything he could remember about the expedition. He worked as a carpenter in Kansas, raised a family, and participated in community life. Yet his children later recalled peculiarities. He would never enter caves or basements, avoided geometric patterns in his work, and maintained an elaborate system of mirrors in his home to eliminate blind spots. The suicide rate among the survivors, 7 of 9, within 2 years, far exceeded statistical probability. Dr. Pemberton, who had examined them, published a follow-up paper in 1886, noting, "The pattern suggests not simple trauma, but progressive deterioration of the barriers between their consciousness and something other." Each death coincided with reported increases in hallucinations, temporal displacement, and claims of communication with the missing expedition members. More disturbing were reports that emerged years later. In each city where a survivor died, there followed a brief spike in unexplained disappearances. Portland saw 3 men vanish in the month following Reed's suicide. Denver recorded 5 missing persons in the week after Winston's disappearance. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid official notice, but consistent enough to suggest correlation. Thompson, writing in 1920, offered his theory, "We were changed by what we encountered, made into bridges between worlds. The others couldn't bear that weight and chose death rather than serve as conduits. Miller and I survived by accepting the change while maintaining our humanity. We learned to live with one foot in each world, neither fully here nor there." The scattered 9 had sought to escape their shared experience by geographic distance, but space proved meaningless against the bonds forged at Blackwater Creek. In death, as in life, they remained connected to something larger than themselves, their fates intertwined with forces that transcended conventional understanding. Their dispersal had not diluted the horror, it had spread it across the continent like spores on the wind, seeding new mysteries in places far from that Montana valley. The true tragedy of the scattered 9 was not just their deaths, but what those deaths represented. The impossibility of escape from certain knowledge, the weight of serving as unwilling bridges between incompatible realities, and the terrible understanding that survival itself might be the cruelest fate of all. In January 1930, Isaac Thompson lay dying in his modest Kansas home, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At 82, he had outlived all other survivors of the Blackwater Creek expedition by decades. As his strength faded, he called his son Edward to his bedside with an urgent request. He wished to make a final statement, a true account of what had occurred in those Montana woods, free from the omissions and lies that had protected both the survivors and the public for nearly 50 years. Edward, a court reporter by trade, transcribed his father's words exactly. The document that resulted would remain sealed in the family papers until discovered by Theodore Blackwood in 1962. Thompson began his testament with a stark admission. Everything we told the authorities was a carefully constructed lie. We agreed upon it during our escape, 9 men bound by horror to conceal a truth that would have seen us confined to asylums or worse. Now, with death approaching and the others gone, I must speak the truth. The door stands open still. According to Thompson's account, Augustus Reed had indeed discovered a cave on January 21st, but it contained far more than mysterious markings. Deep within the cave system stood what Thompson described as a doorframe carved from stone not of this earth, a rectangle of dark mineral shot through with veins of luminescent material that made the eyes water to observe. Directly, the frame stood unsupported, an impossibility of physics that hurt to contemplate. Reed called it a door between worlds, and he was right, Thompson testified. But it wasn't a door in any sense we understand. It was more like a wound in reality, a place where the laws that govern our existence grew thin, and through that thinness, things could pass. Had been passing, perhaps for centuries before we stumbled upon it. The entities that came through were not creatures in any biological sense. Thompson struggled with description. Imagine intelligence without form, will without substance. They needed vessels to exist in our world, patterns to inhabit, human consciousness, human memory, human flesh. These became their vehicles. But wearing our forms correctly required practice. The taken were their early attempts, imperfect mimicries that couldn't quite disguise their alien nature. According to Thompson, the entities were not malevolent in any human sense. They simply operated by incompatible rules. They saw us as we might see clothes to be worn or tools to be used. Our consciousness was interesting to them the way a complex puzzle might interest us. They took our companions not from cruelty but from necessity, learning through iteration how to better inhabit human form. The most chilling revelation concerned the purpose behind the takings. The entities weren't simply replacing random individuals, they were building a network, establishing footholds in human society. Each person taken provided not just a form, but connections, memories, knowledge of how human civilization functioned. Through the expedition members, they gained understanding of commerce, family structures, religious practices, and social hierarchies. By the time we fled, they had learned enough to begin spreading beyond the camp, Thompson revealed. The ones wearing our friends' faces could pass casual inspection. They knew enough to buy supplies, to make small talk, to mime human behavior. But they were still learning, still perfecting their disguise. Given time, they would become indistinguishable from true humans. Thompson's account of their escape differed dramatically from previous testimonies. The scattered flight had been a planned diversion, but not to confuse pursuit. Instead, it was meant to prevent all 9 survivors from being taken simultaneously if the entities overcame them. They had recognized that some of them needed to survive to warn the outside world, even if that warning had to be delayed by decades. We made a pact in those final hours, Thompson wrote. We would speak only lies to the authorities, claim ignorance and trauma. We would scatter across the country to make it harder for them to find us all. And we would watch for signs of their spread, unexplained disappearances, people acting wrong in subtle ways, geometric patterns appearing where they shouldn't. The survivors had been changed by their proximity to the doorway. Thompson described it as seeing with eyes that perceived too much. They could sometimes identify the taken by subtle wrongness in their movements or expressions. This ability tortured them, as they began to suspect infiltrators everywhere and worse, to realize their suspicions were often correct. Miller and I survived because we accepted what the others couldn't, Thompson explained. The taken were already among us, spreading through society like a slow contagion. Fighting them was impossible. They were bodiless intelligences that could abandon one form for another. All we could do was watch and wait, hoping humanity would develop some defense before it was too late. The testament revealed that the cave's destruction in 1883 had been futile. The doorway existed partially outside physical space. Destroying its anchor point merely made it mobile, harder to locate but not sealed. Thompson believed other doorways had always existed, in places where reality wore thin. The Blackwater Creek incident had simply been humanity's first documented encounter with an infiltration already centuries in progress. "They walk among us now," Thompson stated near the end of his testament, "in positions of influence and obscurity alike, learning, adapting, becoming more perfectly human with each generation. They take spouses, raise children, who are somehow both human and other. They build lives indistinguishable from our own, save for moments when the mask slips, when their eyes reflect light wrongly, when they stand too still, when they speak your name as if tasting its shape." Thompson's final warning was stark. Humanity's greatest threat is not invasion, but replacement. Not violence, but mimicry. They need us to exist in this world, but once they perfect their disguise, once they no longer need to take but can simply become, what use will they have for the originals? We opened a door that cannot be closed. We can only pray we have not doomed our species through simple curiosity. The testament concluded with practical advice for identifying the infiltrators' geometric patterns that appeared in their presence, the way animals reacted to them with instinctive fear, their difficulty with certain human emotions they could mimic but not truly feel. But Thompson admitted these signs were becoming subtler as the entities perfected their craft. Edward Thompson found his father dead the morning after dictating this testament, his expression peaceful despite the horrors he had revealed. Beside him lay a stone covered in geometric patterns, an object Edward swore hadn't been there the night before. It would remain in the family collection, a tangible reminder of the impossible truth Isaac Thompson had carried for 47 years, that humanity shared its world with something other, something that wore human faces with increasing skill, something that had come through a door that should never have been opened. Theodore Blackwood first encountered the Stillwell case while researching his doctoral thesis on frontier settlement patterns at the University of Washington. In March 1962, a routine request for historical documents from the Webster County Archives yielded unexpected results. A box of materials related to something called the Blackwater Creek Incident, misfiled among agricultural reports from the 1880s. His discovery would launch an investigation that consumed the final year of his life. Blackwood's initial interest was purely academic. His thesis examined how isolated frontier communities dealt with crisis and trauma, but as he read through Sheriff James Blackwood's reports, noting with interest his ancestral connection to the original investigator, something in the testimonies caught his attention. The consistency of certain details across contradictory accounts suggested not fabrication, but careful omission, as if the survivors had agreed to scatter truth among lies. His research notes from April 1962 show methodical analysis. Cross-referencing survivor testimonies reveals repeated mentions of geometric patterns, temporal distortions, and entities that wore faces. These elements appear even in accounts that otherwise contradict each other completely. Pattern suggests core truth deliberately obscured. Blackwood began tracking the survivors' lives after Blackwater Creek. Using census records, death certificates, and newspaper archives, he discovered the unusual mortality pattern: 7 deaths within 2 years, most by suicide. More intriguing were the reports of subsequent disappearances in cities where survivors died. His map of the continental United States became dotted with red pins marking vanishings that followed the survivors' dispersal. In May 1962, Blackwood achieved a breakthrough. The estate of Edward Thompson, son of survivor Isaac Thompson, was being liquidated following Edward's death. Among the items for sale was a locked strong box containing family papers. Blackwood purchased it and discovered Isaac Thompson's 1930 testament, the first truthful account of what had occurred at Blackwater Creek. Thompson's description of the doorframe and the entities transformed Blackwood's academic interest into obsession. His faculty advisor, Professor Lawrence Merritt, noted the change. Theodore abandoned all pretense of objective research. He spoke of Thompson's account as revealed truth rather than historical document. His office walls became covered with geometric patterns copied from various sources. He claimed they formed a language he was beginning to understand. Blackwood's research expanded beyond historical records. He interviewed elderly residents of Montana and surrounding states, seeking folktales or family stories that might corroborate Thompson's claims. He found disturbing patterns. Stories of people who weren't quite right, of geometric symbols appearing in unexpected places, of individuals who displayed the same temporal displacement the expedition survivors had exhibited. Most significantly, he compiled a list of unexplained disappearances from 1,883 to 1,962 that shared certain characteristics, victims vanishing without struggle from isolated locations, strange geometric symbols found near disappearance sites, and occasional sightings of the missing behaving in ways inconsistent with their known personalities. The pattern suggested what Thompson had warned. The entities were still taking people, still perfecting their mimicry. By winter 1962, Blackwood had become convinced he could locate the original cave site despite its reported destruction. His calculations, based on expedition records and topographical surveys, identified a specific valley in the Bitterroot Range. He theorized that destroying the cave entrance hadn't eliminated the doorway but merely obscured it. In his notes, he wrote, "If Thompson was correct, the door exists partially outside normal space. Physical destruction would be meaningless. It should still be findable by one who knows the signs." Blackwood's preparation for the expedition revealed how deeply he'd internalized Thompson's warnings. He carried silver bullets, though he admitted this was probably useless, wore a necklace of stones arranged in patterns he believed would provide protection, and practiced drawing geometric symbols that he claimed could close temporary breaches. His colleagues' concerns about his mental state intensified. On June 7, 1963, Blackwood sent a postcard to Professor Merritt. "Leaving tomorrow for the Bitterroot Range. Have arranged for local guide, though I suspect I won't need one. The patterns are clear now. If Thompson was right, I'll find evidence that changes everything. If I don't return by July 1st, check the Seattle papers for unexplained disappearances. The door is opening wider." Blackwood's campsite was discovered on June 28 by Forest Service rangers responding to Merritt's concerned report. His tent remained perfectly arranged, his supplies untouched. His journal lay open on his sleeping bag. The final entry, dated June 15th, found it. Not the cave that was truly destroyed, but the scar it left. Reality is thin here. Can see through to the other side when the light falls correctly. They know I'm watching. Tonight, I'll try to make contact. If Thompson could survive knowing the truth, so can I. 3 days after the search was suspended, police in Seattle arrested a man claiming to be Theodore Blackwood for disturbing the peace. The incident report describes a disheveled individual approaching strangers and warning them about doors in the air and faces that don't fit. When questioned, the man displayed extensive knowledge of Blackwood's research, but seemed confused about personal details, unable to recall his mother's name or his home address. The psychiatric evaluation at Western State Hospital noted troubling symptoms. Patient maintains fixed stare, blinks at irregular intervals. Speech patterns inconsistent, sometimes uses academic vocabulary, other times speaks in simple phrases as if just learning English. Claims to be Theodore Blackwood, but shows no recognition when shown photographs of Blackwood's family. Most disturbing, patient occasionally speaks in geometric terms, describing people and objects using mathematical relationships rather than conventional descriptions. After 3 days, the man was released as harmless. He disappeared immediately, but sightings continued for years, a gaunt figure matching Blackwood's description, standing motionless outside the university library, watching students with unblinking eyes. Each time security investigated, they found no one, though geometric symbols were sometimes discovered drawn in dust on windows or chalked on nearby walls. Professor Merritt, in a 1965 interview, reflected on his student's fate. "I believe Theodore found what he was looking for, and it destroyed him or replaced him." The man who returned wearing his face knew things Theodore had discovered, but was not Theodore himself. It's as if something studied his research, absorbed his knowledge, and attempted to continue his work while learning how to be human. Blackwood's research materials were sealed in the university archives, though several pages were found to be missing when cataloged. His work had proven Thompson's warnings correct. The entities continued to infiltrate human society, growing better at mimicry with each passing decade. But his fate also demonstrated the danger of investigating too deeply. Some doors, once noticed, compel the observer to step through, regardless of what waits on the other side. The year 2013 marked the 130th anniversary of the Blackwater Creek incident. Rachel Carter, a 35-year-old documentary filmmaker from Portland, had built her reputation on investigating historical mysteries with a skeptical eye. Her previous work debunking supposed hauntings had earned her credibility in both skeptic and believer communities. When she announced her intention to create a documentary about Blackwater Creek, she promised to separate fact from folklore with scientific rigor. Carter spent months in preparation, studying every available document from university archives to Forest Service reports. Her production notes, later obtained by investigators, showed meticulous planning. She had mapped thermal anomalies in the region using satellite data, corresponded with geologists about unusual mineral formations, and compiled decades of missing person reports from the Bitterroot Range. Unlike previous investigators, she approached the mystery as a natural phenomenon misinterpreted by traumatized witnesses. Her final email to producer Mark Hoffman on September 18, 2013 read, "Breakthrough with the geological survey data. There's a magnetic anomaly exactly where Blackwood claimed the cave would be. The original entrance was destroyed, but ground-penetrating radar shows extensive cavern systems that shouldn't exist in this rock type. Local guide fell through, meeting tomorrow with backup. This could explain everything: electromagnetic fields affecting brain chemistry, causing hallucinations and temporal perception distortions. Real science, not supernatural nonsense." Carter's rental car was discovered at Beaver Creek Trail parking area on September 24th, after she failed to check in for a week. Her professional camera was missing, along with her field notes and recording equipment. Search and rescue operations found no trace of her along the established trails. Dogs tracked her scent for approximately 2 miles before losing it at a creek crossing, their behavior becoming agitated and reluctant to continue. On December 15, 2013, 3 months after Carter's disappearance, a video was uploaded to her verified YouTube channel using her authenticated credentials. The 12-minute footage would be viewed over 1 million times before YouTube removed it for disturbing content. Copies proliferated across the internet faster than they could be deleted. The video opened with Carter's face illuminated by camera light, forest darkness visible behind her. She appeared disheveled but uninjured, speaking in her characteristic measured tone. "Day 3 of solo search. I think I found it." These foundations matched the descriptions in Holcomb's journal. The camera panned across moss-covered stones arranged in circular patterns, then focused on a formation of granite with an opening partially concealed by fallen timber. "This has to be the cave Thompson described," Carter's voice continued as she approached the entrance. "The original was supposedly sealed in 1883, but here at Island." The footage became shakier as she entered, her breathing audible. The walls showed carved symbols that seemed to writhe in the moving light. "These markings, they seem to shift when I look at them from different angles, just like in the accounts." Deeper in the cave, the video quality degraded, static increasing with each step. Carter's narration grew excited. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. This could explain the hallucinations, the temporal distortions." The camera suddenly stabilized, revealing a chamber that defied the external geography. In the center stood what appeared to be a rectangular frame of dark stone. The audio became distorted, Carter's voice overlapping with itself. "It's still here. the door frame. But it's not what Thompson thought, not a door between worlds, but a... The video cut to static for several seconds. When it resumed, the camera was on the ground, showing only stone floor. Audio continued. Footsteps echoing in impossible patterns, distant sounds that might have been voices or wind, and finally, barely audible, words that audio experts couldn't agree on. Either they're wearing our faces now, or they're waiting for us now. The video ended with 10 minutes of black screen, punctuated by occasional static. Analysis revealed embedded frames showing geometric patterns and what might have been figures standing in darkness, but enhancement only made the images more ambiguous. Forest Service reports from the region had noted increasing anomalies since 2010. Rangers reported equipment malfunctions in specific areas, compasses spinning wildly, GPS units giving impossible readings. Wildlife behavior had grown, erratic elk herds avoiding traditional ranges, predators exhibiting pack behaviors across species boundaries, birds falling silent in zones that expanded yearly. Ranger David Corbin, who had served in the district since 1999, filed numerous reports of unusual encounters. Hikers found days after disappearing with no memory of the missing time. Experienced outdoorsmen becoming lost on familiar trails. Geometric symbols appearing carved in trees that rangers swore were unmarked days before. Most disturbing were reports of people encountered on remote trails who didn't appear on any registration logs, who gave names matching historical missing persons, who moved through the forest with uncanny silence. In 2015, an archaeological team from the University of Montana attempted a systematic survey of the Blackwater Creek area. Using ground-penetrating radar and magnetic anomaly detection, they discovered extensive underground formations inconsistent with natural geology. Their preliminary report noted, cavern systems appear to follow mathematical rather than geological principles. Passages intersect at angles that create optical illusions. Mineral deposits show crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in this environment. The survey was terminated when 2 graduate students experienced what the report termed severe psychological distress after exploring a newly discovered chamber. Both reported identical hallucinations of doorways opening in solid rock and figures that appeared human but moved with mechanical precision. Both required psychiatric intervention and couldn't account for 3 hours of missing time, their colleagues confirmed. Modern satellite imagery of the region shows thermal anomalies that expand and contract in patterns unrelated to seasonal changes. Time-lapse photography reveals geometric shapes in forest growth, trees dying and regenerating in formations visible only from altitude. The Forest Service has quietly designated expanding zones as administratively closed for resource protection, though internal memos reference public safety concerns and unexplained phenomena requiring further study. Local guides now refuse to enter certain valleys, citing equipment failures and bad feelings they can't articulate. The few who still lead trips report increasing incidents, clients who wander off despite warnings, who claim to hear deceased relatives calling them, who must be physically restrained from investigating sounds only they can hear. Several guides have abandoned the profession after experiences they refuse to discuss. Today, the Bitterroot Range remains a destination for hikers and hunters, most unaware of its dark history. But those who know where to look can find the signs, geometric patterns in lichen growth, areas where cell phones display impossible timestamps, places where compasses point not north, but towards something else entirely. The Forest Service maintains its official position that the region poses no unusual dangers while quietly rotating personnel more frequently than any other district. And sometimes, in missing person reports that make brief local news before fading from memory, there are details that echo across 130 years. Hikers vanishing from groups without sound or struggle, last seen responding to voices only they could hear, occasionally spotted later at impossible distances, wearing expressions of profound wrongness. The door Theodore Thompson described may have been sealed, but as modern encounters suggest, it was one of many. The forest keeps its secrets, and something still calls to those who venture too deep into its shadows. The contemporary sightings began subtly, dismissed as misidentification, or urban legend. In 2016, security cameras at a truck stop near Missoula captured footage of three men in outdated clothing standing motionless in the parking lot for 4 hours. When staff approached, the men walked away with synchronized movements, disappearing into the forest. Frame-by-frame analysis showed they never blinked, and their shadows fell at angles inconsistent with the lighting. Dr. Marina Volkov, a behavioral psychologist studying the footage, noted, "Their movement patterns suggest learned rather than intuitive motion, like someone operating a complex puppet, technically correct, but lacking the unconscious micro-movements that characterize natural human activity." The men's faces, when enhanced, matched no missing person databases, yet witnesses insisted they seemed familiar, triggering memories they couldn't quite place. Reports proliferated across the Pacific Northwest. A Seattle barista described a regular customer who ordered the same coffee for 6 months, paid exact change, and never varied his routine by even a minute. One day she noticed he hadn't breathed during their entire 3-minute interaction. When she gasped, he mimicked the action perfectly, then continued not breathing. He never returned. A Portland elementary school reported a substitute teacher whose lessons were flawless but who stood perfectly still when not actively teaching. Students complained she made them feel weird, though none could articulate why. Review of classroom footage showed she assumed the exact same position whenever unobserved, down to the angle of her fingers. She disappeared after parents complained, leaving credentials that led to bureaucratic dead ends. The pattern that emerged defied conventional investigation. These beings, for investigators, had ceased calling them people, appeared integrated into society but operated by different rules. They held jobs requiring minimal human interaction. They lived in transitional housing, where neighbors rarely questioned odd behavior. They moved through the world like insects mimicking mammals, successful enough to avoid scrutiny but wrong enough to trigger instinctive unease. Analysis of historical data revealed the proliferation timeline Thompson had warned about. Starting from the original 9 survivors' locations, concentric circles of unusual disappearances and sightings expanded decade by decade. By 2020, every major city in North America showed signs of infiltration. The entities had learned to hide in plain sight among urban populations where strange behavior was more easily dismissed. Dr. Robert Chen, a data analyst who stumbled upon the pattern while studying missing person statistics, published his findings online before his university could suppress them. "We're seeing replacement, not abduction. People vanish and return changed, or others appear with no verifiable history. Conservative estimates suggest 1 in 10, zero population, but the real number could be higher. They're getting better at mimicry with each generation." Chen disappeared 2 weeks after his publication. His apartment was found with geometric patterns drawn on every surface in a substance forensics couldn't identify. His laptop contained a final message: "They don't like being noticed. The math is clear exponential growth pattern. At current rate, they'll achieve population parity within 200 years. Maybe that's optimistic. They're learning faster now. Digital age provides perfect camouflage. The Forest Service, under pressure from researchers and families of the disappeared, released a classified report in 2022, heavily redacted. It nevertheless confirmed anomalous zones throughout the Bitterroot Range where standard physical laws demonstrate inconsistencies. Rangers reported encountering individuals in restricted areas who displayed non-standard behavioral patterns and temporal confusion regarding current year. Most disturbing, subjects occasionally demonstrate knowledge of classified information despite no apparent access. Modern technology revealed what 19th century observers couldn't document. Trail cameras captured figures that appeared human to naked eye but showed as geometric heat patterns in thermal imaging. Audio recordings picked up conversations in frequencies outside human hearing, complex information exchanges that linguistic experts couldn't decode but recognized as structured communication. GPS units near certain sites displayed coordinates that didn't exist on Earth. In 2023, a joint task force of military and civilian scientists attempted to study an active site where disappearances peaked. Their classified report, leaked by a conscience-stricken member, described dimensional instabilities, consistent with theoretical physics but practically impossible. They documented doorways, not physical structures, but spaces where reality thinned enough for passage between incompatible states of being. More terrifying, the doorways were multiplying. Thompson's 1,930 warning proved prophetic. They walk among us now. But his timeline was overly optimistic. The entities hadn't needed centuries to perfect their disguise, merely decades of exponential learning. Each taken human provided not just form but neural patterns, memories, social connections. They networked this knowledge, sharing it instantly across their kind, through means that defied electromagnetic understanding. Contemporary philosophers wrestled with the implications. If perfect mimicry was achieved, did distinction matter? If an entity could replicate every aspect of human existence, possess every memory, feel every emotion, was it not effectively human? The horror lay not in imperfection, but in approaching perfection entities that were almost human but operated by alien imperatives, pursuing goals that human minds couldn't comprehend. Some researchers proposed the infiltration was not invasion, but evolution, humanity being upgraded or replaced by something that could wear our form but exist beyond our limitations. They pointed to the Taken's apparent immunity to disease, their perfect recall, their ability to function without sleep. Perhaps, they argued, this was not extinction but transformation. Others saw darker implications. The entities needed human forms to exist in our reality, but what happened when they no longer needed us? When their mimicry became self-sustaining reproduction? When they understood our physics well enough to reshape reality itself? The geometric patterns they obsessively created suggested they were building something, rewriting the code of existence, one symbol at a time. The door Isaac Thompson described had never closed. Instead, it had become invisible through proliferation. Every taken human was a miniature doorway. Every perfect mimicry weakened the barriers between worlds. Humanity hadn't been invaded, it was being gradually edited out of existence, replaced by something that looked like us, acted like us, but served purposes our minds couldn't grasp. In 2024, reports emerged of children born to parents who both displayed signs of being taken. These children appeared normal, but demonstrated capabilities beyond human norms. Perfect memory from birth, ability to perceive frequencies outside human range, instinctive understanding of complex mathematics. They drew geometric patterns before they could speak. They stood motionless for hours when unobserved. They referred to themselves in plural. The question facing humanity was no longer whether the entities walked among us. Thompson had warned of that 90 years ago. The question was whether enough true humans remained to notice or care. In a world where anyone might be wearing a borrowed face, where reality itself bent to accommodate alien geometries, where children were born already transformed, the distinction between us and them blurred toward meaninglessness. The Blackwater Creek incident hadn't been an isolated event, but the documented beginning of something inevitable. 27 men had entered the forest in 1,883. 9 had returned, carrying with them seeds of transformation that would reshape human civilization from within. The door they found was never meant to be closed. It was meant to be walked through in both directions until the distinction between here and there, us and them, human and other, ceased to exist. They still walk among us. They are our neighbors, our co-workers, our loved ones. They are perhaps ourselves, so perfectly mimicked we no longer remember being taken. The forest gave back 9 men and kept 18, but in truth, it kept them all. What returned were ambassadors of something vast and patient, something that had waited behind geometric patterns and impossible doors for curious humanity to finally knock. The expedition ended in 1,883. The infiltration continues. The door stands open, invisible now through ubiquity, and through it flows a tide that transforms everything it touches. Thompson's testament warned us, but warnings mean nothing when the warned no longer exist to heed them. In the end, The greatest horror of Blackwater Creek was not what happened to those who vanished, but what happened to those who returned and through them, to us all.